Thank you very much to the organizers of the conference to invite me. I have to read it in English, and listening to the translation simultaneously, that is really a difficult and singular situation for me. But I will make this experiment. I immediately will begin. What are media? No, thank you. Okay. In my book, Piccola Metafisica della Medialità, translated in Italian in 2020, I try to answer this question based on the idea of the messenger, an idea that should not be understood anthropomorphically. Media are in the position of a third that connects two different fields, the poles or systems, to transmit or make accessible something that would remain unattainable without media. But to ask a provocative question, could there be a less exciting, less inspiring definition of what we do with media? My presentation currently pursues two objectives. On the one hand, to demonstrate the productivity and creativity of the messenger model, interpreted as a philosophy of media. On the other hand, to demonstrate the potential of the messenger approach by reflecting on the contemporary artificial intelligence. 4 questions structure the lecture. What problem does the messenger model respond to? What are its key attributes? Third, why should the cultural technique of flattening be understood as a medium? And fourth, what is gained by interpreting artificial intelligence as a contemporary version of the messenger model? Now, my first chapter. In the last third of the past century, a media-critical turn took place in the humanities and social sciences. The term media was not longer reserved for the mass media as newspaper, radio, and television. Now, everything we communicate, we perceive, we experience and recognize was considered something that is communicated, perceived, experienced, and recognized through media. 3 key sentences can explain the almost a priori role of media. The Canadian media theorist Marshall McLuhan writes, "The media are the message." The French philosopher Jacques Derrida says, "There is nothing outside the text." And the German cultural scientist Friedrich Kittler assumes only what is switchable exists. The media critical shift suffered from a childhood disease. The constitutive and constructive role of media was absolutized. A media fundamentalism emerged. The core belief is media create what they transmit. The historical achievement of media fundamentalism was to revise the maxim of media transparency. In day-to-day use, media make their own physical materiality disappear. We do not hear sound waves, but words or music. We see a television image and not pixels. When we use smoothly all media, and not just digital virtual realities, have an inherent, immersive tendency. Media fundamentalism hypothesized the media into an almost causal force that shapes history, society, and culture. Thus, media fundamentalism participates in a modern topos. During secularization, the human subject takes on the God-like, autonomous, divine, creative power, and humans design themselves as homo faber and homo generator. However, with Nietzsche and Foucault, the modern concept of the subject eroded. What follows was that the media are now filling the gap left by the deconstruction of the concept of the subject. The media have become quasi-agents of cultural history. At this point, the question arises that evokes the idea of the messenger model. Is it possible to think about media in such a way that their fundamental influence is acknowledged without at the same time glorifying them as autonomous creators of history and culture, philosophically articulated as the quasi-transcendental a priori to our relationship to the world. Our media philosophy, my media philosophy, explores such an alternative from the perspective of the messenger model. Now, the following sections, it's already outlines 4 attributes that form the conceptual basis of the messenger model. First, heteronomy. Unlike the idea of a creator or an author as an autonomous decision-making authority, the messenger is not independent. The messenger acts on behalf of another. Messengers speak with a foreign voice and are subject to foreign constraints. A media theory based on the messenger principle must accept that there is always something outside of media, and thus also outside of text. Second, distance. Communication does not arise from mutual understanding, established through proximity, intimacy, and consensus. There is no communication without distance. Distance is not limited to the physical separation, but also includes the differences that makes those communicating with each other strangers to one another in the multitude of their different histories and experiences. Communication presupposes being divided, as both Emmanuel Levinas and Jean-Luc Narcy have reminded us. Dealing with what is absent is invisible and therefore not close to us is one, if not the most important source of culture. Thirdness, the messenger model establishes a social relationship in the sense of a triadic structure, for which the messenger is essential without being its subject. Inter-subject relationships are usually conceived as dyadic structures. The appearance of the third party seems disruptive and parasitic, but it is only the transition to thirdness that interpersonal relations and interactions can consolidate into social institutions. And not to forget here the fragility of the messenger's role, which characterizes him as a diabolic figure of reversal. This occurs when the messenger wants to establish himself as an autonomous originator. For example, the angel Lucifer, who wants to be God. And now the last point, sense suspicion. Whatever a message is, it has to be physically detachable and transportable from the situation of its origin. The messenger moves in the space of suspended sense. The externality of meaning is the basis of its operations. Only through the tangible separation of text and texture, of form and content, is transmission possible. So much for the cursory characterization of the messenger model. However, in our efforts to find an alternative to media fundamentalism, are we not losing sign of the fundamental influence of media? How can the transformative power of the media for its content even become a topic of discussion if they are interpreted as an instance of pure transmission? This question brings the concept of transfiguration in play. The transmission that media open up has to be understood as a transfiguration. Transfiguration refers to a fundamental modality of transformation, a metamorphosis in the nature of being. In its religious spiritual origin in the New Testament, Christ, who is considered the mediator between God and humans, appears to three disciples on a mountain, but now transformed into a dazzling, divine figure, so to say, inhuman figure of light. The mediator casts off the materiality of his corporal grounding. Jesus becomes Christ, the Son of God. If we think of media transformation as transfiguration, we encounter an important insight. The medium obscures its own physical presence to manifest what it represents. The dying messenger, as documented in stories ranging from the legend of the Greek marathon runner to the death of Christ, illustrates how a media philosophy avant la lettre can radically conceive of the media's inherent self-abandonment in the act of transmission, the immersion of the user into the medium. Previous considerations are very abstract. Therefore, I will test the explanatory power of the medium as a messenger on a concrete and almost ubiquitous medium. It is a medium that is so discreet in representing something, so readily available and visible to us, that it hardly appears in its own right. It is about artificial two-dimensional flatness in the form of inscribed and illustrated surfaces, about the cultural technique of flattening, understood as a cultural creative, positive potential. We inhabit a three-dimensional world, but we are surrounded by illustrated and inscribed surfaces. Look around here. All kinds of scripts, printed papers, images and photos, technical drawings, display boards, maps, screens, including the electronic interfaces of computers, tablets, and smartphones, are so commonplace that we hardly notice the special form of spatiality embodied by projecting something into two-dimensionality. There are no two-dimensional surfaces empirically, but we treat all kinds of drawings and inscriptions as if they were flat. What is meaningful and makes sense is carved or printed onto a surface. In writing, drawing, doodling, painting, reading, and viewing, the deep structure of a surface tends to be nullified. Artificial flatness is ubiquitous. It's an anthropotechnical medium. Since the development of cave paintings, skin tattooing, and the use of sundials through the invention of pictures, writing diagrams, graphs, and maps, the continuous thread of a cultural technique of flattening has run through cultural history, culminating in the ubiquitous use of screens and smartphones. Within the framework of a familiar rhetoric, profound thinking is dignified. Yet, what remains superficial is discredited. Thinking that deserves its name is oriented towards depth. We have to get to the bottom or behind the things. However, complex thinking and scientific discovery are hardly conceivable without something being written down or rewritten, without operating with visible signs and formulas, producing and interpreting tables, diagrams, graphs, cards, and so on. All these modes of representation explicitly draw on artificial flatness. What the invention of the wheel was for the mobility and creativity in the physical realm is the invention of artificial flatness for the mobility and creativity in the intellectual world. It therefore makes sense to dissolve the straightforward connection between spirit and depth and to shift our perspective. Not only sciences, but also many arts. Think of choreography, musical notation, sketchbooks. Not to mention engineering and architecture achievements, as well as the administration of complex organizations all draw on the use of flat surfaces. Everything that is, okay, sorry, everything that is not yet, and even everything that can never be called, and even the so-called impossible objects can be projected into two-dimensionality as a graphic structure, can be drawn, noted, and then modified and reconfigured in the interplay of hand and eye. From an epistemological perspective, what constitutes the creativity of artificial flatness? Physically situated, we have a genuine orientation system at our disposal. The philosopher Kant already noted that everything physical has three perpendicular axes, right and left, up and down, front and back. What lies behind us, now conceived without a rear view mirror, marks a region that is invisible and therefore uncontrollable. Inscribed surfaces create a kind of spatiality for overview and control and make the invisible, the absent, or purely conceptual, perceptible and processible. And then I go from pages 4, and I now want to show you the relation between the cultural technique of flattening and contemporary artificial intelligence. It is almost a commonplace, especially in the academic world, to fear that the achievements of digitality and artificial intelligence will lead to a flattening of thinking that threatens human intellectual power. In fact, the cognitive consequences of the current use of artificial intelligence cannot be overlooked. There is no question that every new medium comes not only with creative options, but always carries risks and potentials for abuse. The use of artificial intelligence in academia is fundamentally changing the practices of teaching, testing, and research. And in what way is still unclear. However, the following considerations focus on understanding of artificial intelligence that is not overshadowed by dystopian ideas and apocalyptic worries. Wait a moment. 7. No. Okay. The connection between. I have to go further because I want to shorten my thing. I think this one, yes. Okay, sorry for that, but the time is running out of my regime, and therefore I have to shorten and to cut my reading, and therefore now I'm going to show you the relation between writing, the computer, and artificial intelligence. The connection between writing and computerization is constitutive. This is illustrated by the binary alphabet invented by the philosopher Leibniz in the form of dual numbers. Writing is an embryonic form of digitization. To digitize means to break down something that exists as a continuum into individual elements, to code them and to combine them, more or less, arbitrarily. We have to separate the digital from the use of computers, because you see, writing already is an institution of digitality. And to show you this connection is to give you only a glimpse of Ada Lovelace's first running computer program. It was written down a table within the two dimensions of lines and columns. The document of the first functioning computer program, published by Ada Lovelace in 1845, is eloquent testimony to the connection between artificial flatness and computer technology. Understanding computer-generated digitization depends on an epistemic technique of diagramming. Scientific relationships of meanings, are transposed into spatial relationships, where they can be represented and also processed. You see, the point is to transform sense and meaning into spatial relations, something temporal into spatial two-dimensional structure. And now to artificial intelligence. The digitization of data corpora in the context of neural networks and deep learning is based on their decomposition not simply into letters, but rather into tokens. Tokens are genuine writing phenomena composed of a few letters and empty spaces. Training with huge data corpora, which are no longer manageable by humans, is based on operations with quantifiable spatial relationships on the surface. This can be explained by using two examples, one visual and one textual. And I think I will concentrate on the visual only. It is about data as points. If you ask me, sorry, I'm going outside the manuscript. If you ask me what are data, and it's a relevant question, I would answer you, whatever can be transformed into a structure represented by points and clouds of points can be computed artificially, so to say. If a machine is to learn to distinguish, this is an example, between pictures of cats and dogs, it is trained to numerically minimize characteristics that are common to both species, such as having 4 legs, a fur, 2 eyes, a tail, while numerically increasing characteristics that are specific to one species only, retractable claws, flat versus protruding snout, and so on. In this way, the algorithm learns to distinguish between point of clouds of cat images from those of dogs through training and feedback. The software learns to calculate the line that separates the 2 point clouds. It does not understand anything about cats or dogs, only calculating the line for separating the two. The more distant a point is from the line, the more precise the identification. And conversely, the closer a point is to the line, the more difficult the decision. It is clear that statistical analysis methods not only deal with only deal with probabilities, but this value is in clustering, in machine clustering, is usually higher than with human image recognition. It should not be forgotten that the criteria used by the trained algorithm to distinguish between image types and calculate the dividing line remain a black box. The mathematical function calculated by the machine is based on determination using spatial parameters. The trick associated with cultural technique of flattening consists of presenting and processing meaningful semantic content. What is a picture of a cat? What is a picture of a dog? As spatial relationships on the surface. What is close? What is far away? What is on the line? The correlation between meaning and spatial relationships becomes even clearer when we consider operational language processing. Take ambitious words, for example, the German word Bank. It can mean a financial institution and a park bench. With the help of transformer technology, word neighborhoods are identified and weighted. The proximity of words such as customer, credit, and financial service makes it likely that bank refers to financial institution. In contrast, in a context with pond, trees, and children playing, is associated with a park bench. In this way, implicit meanings can also be made explicit by a machine. Implicit means that these connections are included in the available data material, but are not visible to those who created the data. For example, the more texts on European geography are available for training an algorithm, the better it can deduce distances that are not explicitly mentioned. Even if the cartographic distance between Modena and Berlin is not expressly mentioned anywhere in the text, a trained algorithm can extract or calculate this information with stochastic plausibility from a large data corpus. The geographical example can be extrapolated. When large amounts of written knowledge are available as training resource, chatbots can access, compile, correlate and combine extensive amount of implicit knowledge. In doing so, chatbots do not leave the token perspective. They operate in a pure data universe. have no access to the outside world, and therefore no knowledge. Ironically, artificial intelligence operates in a post-structuralist paradise of pure textuality. However, since the training data encompasses large parts of collective memory, a form of computer-assisted social knowledge emerges that can be used by individuals and at the same time far surpasses any individual memory, scientific handbook, library, or encyclopedia online. Artificial intelligence can become a messenger that makes collectively generated explicit and implicit knowledge accessible and usable for individuals. At this point, let us ask what insight about artificial intelligence can be gained from the four attributes of the messenger model. May I continue? Okay. To heteronomy. But now, okay, because I see time, you see. To control space sometimes is easier than to control time. And therefore, I want to cut a little bit down. And therefore, I'm going to slide 21. And the following sentence is, and last but not least. Okay, it's... and last but not least, the suspension of sense. Remember, the messenger is acting without sense, without making sense out of the narrative. He or she has to transform. Let us remember, messenger operate in the space in between, detached from meaning, based on the separation of text and texture, content and form. What the interpretation means is controversial and cannot be clarified here in the tent. But one thing is becoming apparent in the context of the cultural technique of flattening. Humans have to interpret in order to be able to use text and images. No way out of interpretation. Sorry, I have to find my place in the manuscript. Yes, through interpretation, humans are adding an imaginary or virtual, and in any case, invisible depth to the culturally amputated depth dimension. You see the relation. First, you put it away, the depth. By interpretation, we figure something like imaginary depth. But the machine has not to do that. Therefore, a provocative question. Is interpretation a kind of compensation for the cultural reduction of two-dimensionality, all things to two-dimensionality, for cutting off depth? Machines do not interpret. That's my position. They operate on a token statistical basis, and thanks to their distant reading, are functionally capable of discovering invisible patterns, but also of generating new patterns, whether meaningful or meaningless. The transfiguration that takes place here thus becomes apparent. What, from the human perspectivity of human activity, is an interpretable text generated by the machine. But from the perspective of the machine, the token statistical prediction of the most plausible responsive to a prompt is without sense and meaning for the machine. When Alan Turing attempted to mechanically decrypt messages from Hitler's Navy that had been encrypted by the Enigma coding machine during World War II, he took a cryptological approach based on statistical letter configurations. And before him, the Russian mathematician Andrei Markov had already applied statistical methods to literature. So it is humans themselves who invented the possibility of treating texts as mere token relations. But what is essential to this transfiguration of interpretable science into token statistical data is that we can never adopt both perspectives at the same time. Just like Wittgenstein's rapid duck reversible image, only one of the perspectives can ever be realized in the same moment. And this is my last sentence, and this is precisely why humans and artificial intelligence are mutually dependent on an interplay between human interpretation and machine-like token statistics. Thank you very much for listening.